We're just going to take a call. Who am I speaking to?
It's Valentino Assenza.
Valentino Assenza. That sounds like an impossible name. But anyway, Valentino, what do you have to say?
Well, I just want to say, in terms of, we recently had a great poet pass away, Maya Angelou, and one of the things that she had said was, words mean more than what is said down on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with deeper meaning. Whether you're at a slam or whether you're at, say, featuring at the art bar, I think it's important how you transcend your words to the audience. Bill Bissett does this, George Eliot Clark does this, Robert Priest does this. All of their works are unbelievably substantial, but at the same time, they make a point to also engage the audience for a reading as well. So, I mean, to say that, outside of slam, a poet won't care what the audience think, I think is a bit inaccurate, quite honestly.
Okay, that's Valentino Assenza we're talking to. I hope you're enjoying CIUT 89.5 FM's Howl with Big Beat. We've got a panel discussion. Are poetry slams hurting or are they helping poetry? I mean, some people say they're helping it because, let's face it, they're getting all these young people that wouldn't come to one of my readings. They're there and they're having a great time.
But that's kind of like what people say, as long as they're reading. As long as they're reading, I think it does make a difference to what you are reading, what you are taking in.
Okay.
But I will offer examples of going into schools as a workshop leader, teaching spoken word, and turning kids on to the craft of spoken word, and they have been led back to literary poetry based on finding poetry. So I won't agree with Luciano fully that poets who dive into spoken word solely, that's all they do. They only listen to Shane Koizan and hip-hop, and that's all, and they never get back to the classics. I think it can start a spark in especially a young person and get them learning about it, because they might have been turned off by the curriculum at school, and they might have not learned that there can be poetry by people that are not dead white guys, that there can be poetry by people living in their circumstances from their certain background, especially if they're not from Canada, that can almost feel like it's talking about their experience. And I think that's what spoken word has often done, is tell people, this is the experience that I've dealt with. Maybe you can't relate, whether it's about domestic abuse, whether it's about racialization in Toronto, or whether it's about something as ephemeral as online dating. But perhaps, if you can relate to it, you can join me in this kind of shared experience. And that's what all live events are, whether it's sports or concerts. It's sharing in something that maybe you wouldn't have had by yourself.
You know what? I may have been too hasty. Yes, like I've been to some of the seminars that you've given in schools, and occasionally there's a kid there, who has no interest at all in language, and suddenly slam is, gets their imagination, and they go from there, and they might start off as a slam poet, and as a result, explore other writers and other fields of writing.
I have to. Could I just chime in here? I just wanted to speak to one point that Madison had made with respect to slam poets being, I'd be paraphrasing at this point, but he said that slam poets were casual or were not as systemic as, say, other poets. Am I wrong in saying that?
I'm not exactly sure what you're trying to say.
Well, I took what you were saying as that there was less discipline in being a slam poet than there was in being any other poet, and I just want to put it out there that slam poets are extremely systemic about how they perform their poetry.
Maybe they're too ideological then.
They're very ritualistic, especially when it comes to preparing for festivals such as the Canadian Festival of Spoken Word and the National Poetry Slam. I can say with great faith that the coach of last year's Toronto Poetry Slam team took the poets out of their comfort zone and systematically broke them down to write pieces that they would not normally write, and that's how they came away with a championship last year.
You know what Nietzsche said about faith? He said, faith is not wanting to know the truth. But, I mean, I'm not saying that the poetry slams are devoid of talent and sometimes don't hit the mark. But in general, and I think that it's not just poetry slams, it's also the poetry readings as well. I think you get far too much confessional poetry.
Oh, yeah.
It's far too confessional. It's overtly emotional. And what I'm saying and what I'm suggesting, and I'm not saying that the slams are, should be rid of, but maybe to get that under wraps, again, it's the words, it's the power of the word, it's spoken word, it's the word,
Thanks for your call, Valentino. We actually got to move on to our next caller. Thanks so much for your
All right.
input. Really appreciate it, Val.
Okay, cheers.
Cheers. Take care. Thank you. Okay, this is Nick Beat, and this is Howl, of course, and we're having a panel discussion. For those who have just joined us, I'm with panelists Luciano Jacobelli, and of course Madison Shadwell, and my good friend Dave Silverberg, and we are here discussing the central point, which is do poetry slams hurt or help poetry? We have a caller. Who are we talking to?
Banoo.
Sorry, say that
Hi.
again?
Banoo.
Oh, Banoo, it's good to talk to you. Sorry about that. Good to talk to you, Ben. What's your position on it?
Well, as a poet, I guess I stand in somewhere in between. I don't know if I could call myself a page poet or a stage poet, but I think there's two very strong traditions of poetry going on in Toronto and in many other parts of the world, the page poetry and the stage poetry. And I think it's time for these two camps to meet each other. And I expect that once this happens, there would be a really strong poetry movement that would be created. And I think each one of them has strengths that, they can, the other group can learn from. For me, slam poetry, because it's usually very politically up to date and it's about the world we live in, fulfills actually a very important mission that I think that poetry sometimes forgets that it needs to carry out. And I also think that the so-called page poetry or the formal poetry has virtues that slam poetry can learn from in terms of the subtleties of language that usually the page poets actually have.
This is Banoo Zan we're talking to on CIUT's Howl with Nick Beat. Hope you're enjoying the show. What's your take on what Banoo was saying, Madison?
Well, I concur with a lot of what she's saying. As far as the fusing of I see a crossover of poets going to slams and slam artists going to poetry readings. I think there's a bit of a crossover. But part of the problem is once again, the lack of points of reference and cultivation and a willingness to open up and listen to somebody else and perhaps even take a critique without being defensive. And more than just a boo or a hiss, but an actual genuine, authentic, well-articulated critique. And the problem with today's society also is that clarity can come off as aggressiveness. So if somebody speaks with clarity and elegance, a lot of people perceive that as aggressive. And that's how far down, how degraded language has become.
Dave?
I think I'll go back to what Luciano said, is that there's going to be a lot of drivel at poetry slams. There's going to be a lot of poets that taint the experience that Madison might have experienced at a poetry slam, but the great poets, and maybe they don't always go to poetry slams, whether they're spoken word or otherwise, are ones that do take words into careful consideration, who elevate their talent, who have that curiosity to learn more about poetry than just beyond the spoken word artists among them. And you just have to dig to find them out. It's easy to kind of paint everything with a broad brush, and I committed the same foul many times with the literary community, but I've learned that it's as multifaceted as any community in the arts scene in Toronto, and that you have to do a bit of work to find the artists that resonate with you and that you feel accomplish and give honor to the art of word. And I can rattle off some names here, but I think it's worth it for a lot of people out there interested in spoken word or literary poetry to put some work into finding the artists and the scenes that they feel very comfortable with.
Banoo, thanks so much for calling in. Really appreciate your phone call and and what you
Thank
were
you.
saying. Thank you, Banoo, very much.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. This is Nick Beat on CIUT's Howl. Your take on our discussion?
Well, I think it was Madison who was speaking about the language and the audience not being aware of like the cultural aspects of poetry. Was it Madison?
Yes, it was.
Oh, okay. So in regards to that, I wanted to say that, it was a very good point you made, and in regards to pop culture in general, you brought music into the equation, and you made a point that people say, oh, they like music, and then they can't name a band, and it's the same with poetry. And I wanted to say that, I've done a lot of reading, and it seems like even in Shakespeare's time, the masses didn't really know what was going on. They weren't educated, but he was popular. And I think it comes down, you can't really expect the masses to know what's going on. It's a nice thought, it's an ideal, and I would like that too. But I suppose it's like, usually only the musicians will be able to list off a number of bands that they like, or if you go to a serious concert and, there's hardcore people, they'll be able to talk about music. But if you go to like a Britney Spears concert, they're not going to have anything to say. And in a way, slam is kind of like people are there to hear slam poetry and see a performance, or like a comedy show. They might not be able to tell you, the greatest comedians of all time, but they're there, and at least they're being exposed to it. And I suppose it's the poets on stage who would know more about poetry. And I think maybe if you went to even a regular poetry event, a lot of people wouldn't know about, necessarily the great poets. And maybe just exposure
I
is the
concur
main
with you.
thing.
Yeah, no, I agree with you absolutely. Once again, I think that there's a lack of cultivation, excavation with the poets and the slam poets as well. I think it's definitely cultural, but in these environments, it shouldn't be so symptomatic, because you're going there, you should have an interest or take an interest. Exactly. And usually when you approach people, or I find when I approach people, just simply asking them, what poets they read, they get rather defensive about that, because they know that they're not cultivated. Deep down, they know. With words and language, you can't hide. You can't hide behind them. You'll be exposed.
But are poetry slams hurting that? Or are they engendering? Like Dave was making an earlier point that it's getting people into poetry itself as a subject itself.
I think that poetry slams, it's a good question. I think, they're catering to it. And they're catering to, it's like the pop culture poetry maybe. They're catering to what the masses want, and the evidence that they're the most successful form of,
They know what they want, but I know what they need.
Yeah, exactly. They need education. But in culture.
I think another way to rephrase the question is slam poetry taking us one step backwards rather than forward in terms of the craft of poetry, and sometimes it does take us backwards. If an audience member is hooked on slam poetry and thinks that poetry is all about gushing it out, outpouring, all about putting your feelings down, politically correct sentiments, saying them loudly, saying them theatrically. If they think that is a poetic engagement, then they're wrong. That is not the true poetic engagement.
I think it's fair to say that's one type of poetic engagement.
But do those people stay there? That's the question. Do they ever go beyond that point, do they ever say, you know what, maybe it isn't this, maybe there's more, maybe, let me explore where else language has been, and
Stefan
that's where the
Mallarmé,
culture.
Baudelaire,
Yeah, but
Rimbaud,
my fear, Dave, is that they stay there.
I
That they're exposed to that, and that is where they remain.
Just one quick example. There's a poet in our scene named Lara Bozabalian who
Right.
came to poetry from a literary perspective. She was quite involved with, educating youth as a high school teacher. Got into our scene from the literary community. Was on our slam team for a couple years. Then returned back to the literary community to focus on publishing 2 books of poetry that, on their own, whether performed on the stage or orally, are actually exquisite poetry, and a lot of our peers in both camps agree that Lara fits in both scenes and straddles both communities very smoothly. And she's not alone in terms of Canadian canon of being a kind of poet that finds value in spoken word, returns to something that is perhaps more traditional and built on the roots of poetry, and finding something that speaks to her. Perhaps one day she wants to do spoken word and she can, but then the other day she can submit a poem to Arc Magazine and validate herself in that kind of form.
Well, yeah, I think growth is a natural process for anyone that is interested in something. And, for the ones that will stay there or regress, they're not going to grow, and
But
they will
without
ultimately
pointing
dwindle away.
without the points of reference being, exhibited. Without access to the points of reference, they're not going to be able to excavate,
Is there something about
I'd
the
like to-
slam structure that prevents growth? That's the question. Is there something about the whole format, the whole system of slam that doesn't encourage that moving forward, but
I think
encourages the there?
It's some of what you're talking about. The over-emotive expression gets in the way of language. The language should be doing that itself.
I'm sorry
that's
to,
why
I
you
think
move
the
into theater.
popularity
But I-
contest aspect would also
Yeah.
prevent
It's
slam
kind of
growth,
narcissistic.
because people
It's
are there for the
narcissistic.
fame, for the momentary,
Yeah.
glitz.
Glory. Yeah. Narcissistic.
sorry to cut into you, Ivy. Thanks so much for calling in.
No
Really
problem.
appreciate your input, big time.